The mine was sealed without explanation, and the company offered no account that any man who had been there believed. 5 men went into that shaft on a November night, and when they were brought to the surface before dawn the following morning, their eyes had been burned, the flat, opaque black of charcoal, and not one of them ever worked underground again. I was among the men who carried them out of the lower gallery. I have been trying to find words adequate to that morning for 51 years, and I have concluded that the right words do not exist, so I will settle for the accurate one. My name is Caleb Doss. I was born in 1877 in McDowell County, West Virginia, the son of a coal miner and the grandson of one before him, and by the autumn of 1908 I had worked the underground seams of the southern counties for 11 years. I had been at operations in McDowell, Wyoming, and Logan counties before I accepted a position with the Mingo Consolidated Coal Company at the Spruce Creek No. 4 shaft near the settlement of Lick Creek in Mingo County in September of 1908. I was 31 years old. I was considered reliable and skilled, and I did not think of the work as dangerous in the way that outsiders imagined it. You learned the mountain. You learned its sounds and its silences and the quality of its air in different sections at different seasons, and you learned when the rock was stable and when it was not, and you learned when to push forward and when to stay still. 11 years of that learning had made me careful in the particular way that underground work makes a man careful, attentive to small things, slow to dismiss the evidence of his senses, inclined to trust the body's readings before the mind's explanations. The Spruce Creek No. 4 had been operating since 1905. By the autumn of 1908, it employed 23 men across 2 shifts, running coal from a seam that sat roughly 400 feet beneath the surface of the ridge. The production numbers were consistently good. The main seam was clean, bituminous coal that burned well and came out of the rock without significant contamination, and the overlying rock was stable enough that the timber requirements were modest by the standards of the county. The company in Williamson was satisfied, and the men were paid on time, which in those years defined a successful mining operation as completely as any other measure. The shaft was equipped with a timber cage on a cable system operated by a surface winding engine, and a separate tramway arrangement for the coal tubs. The main gallery ran roughly east from the shaft bottom at 400 feet, with a north lateral and a south lateral cutting into the seam from different points along the main gallery. The crew of 23 was divided across day and night shifts with Hollis Greer as overall foreman and a surface crew of 4 who operated the winding engine, handled the tub processing at the tipple, and maintained the surface infrastructure. Hollis Greer was about 55 years old in the autumn of 1908, originally from Bell County in Kentucky, and he had been mining since his early teens. He carried 40 years of underground experience in the specific way that deeply experienced men carry it. Not in stories or freely offered expertise, but in a settled attentiveness to the rock and air and sounds around him that was simply part of how he moved through the world. He was not a man who explained himself or sought agreement for his decisions. He gave clear instructions and expected them followed, and he had the specific quality of authority that does not require enforcement because it is recognized as competent. I want to describe the men who were most directly involved in what happened at the Spruce Creek No. 4, because the account requires them to be understood as real people, and because I believe they deserve that acknowledgement. Carl Kettner was 44 years old in 1908, a native of Scranton, Pennsylvania, who had come south after the anthracite operations in the Northeast began to slow. He was tall and spare, with gray in his beard, and he spoke rarely, and when he did, he spoke precisely, offering facts rather than interpretations, corrections rather than opinions. He had a quality of stillness underground that I recognized from the best miners I had worked alongside over the years, a settled physical patience in the dark corridors that indicated a man who had made his peace with enclosed spaces and low light and the weight of rock on all sides. I had worked with him at 2 previous operations before the Spruce Creek No. 4, and I trusted his reports the way you trust a surveying instrument you have used long enough to know its calibration. James Ray Combs was 38 and from Mingo County originally. The son of a farming family who had come to the mines in his early 20s when the coal operations expanded through the southern counties. He was the section foreman for the night shift and had worked for Hollis Greer for 4 years without a recorded difficulty of any kind. He was a quiet family man, married with 2 daughters, who kept a garden at his house in Lick Creek and was known among the crew for a steadiness under pressure that expressed itself not in dramatic action, but in the absence of wasted motion. When something went wrong in the section James Ray Combs supervised, the men around him automatically slowed and waited for his assessment before making any decision, because his assessments were reliable and his decisions under pressure were sound. He was not a man who dramatized difficulties. He identified them and addressed them. August Prater was 26 and from McDowell County, and he had been at the No. 4 for about a year before the events of November occurred. He was an energetic, careful worker who was saving money to marry a woman from Welch and who spoke about her with the combination of pride and embarrassment that young men carry when their intentions are serious and they are not yet certain how to carry those intentions in public. He was not imaginative. He worked with his body and his attention to the practical tasks in front of him, and he did not spend time on things that could not be measured or addressed directly. The man I knew only as Dillard was 22 and from Logan County, and he had come to the Spruce Creek operation in the spring looking for work. His given name may have been Elias or possibly Ellis, but I never confirmed it, and the company records, which I examined briefly some years later through a contact at the Williamson office, listed him only as J.E. Dillard. He was younger than the others and somewhat quieter, but he worked consistently and did not complain. And the other men liked him in the uncomplicated way that a crew likes a young worker who does not cause problems and does his share without having to be managed. Wesky was a Polish immigrant, whose full name none of us could pronounce reliably, who had come to West Virginia through the Pennsylvania coal districts and who spoke functional English but still relied on gesture and physical demonstration for any communication of complexity. He was a powerful, broad-shouldered man who was excellent with the pick and who kept largely to himself without being unfriendly. He attended Mass at a Polish Catholic church in Williamson on Sunday mornings and was known to carry a small wooden cross in his shirt pocket when he worked underground, which several of the other men considered eccentric and none considered worth remarking on. These 5 men were the night shift crew of the lower section on November 2nd and the early morning of November 3rd, 1908. I want to tell you what led up to that night in the order it actually happened, because the order is important. The order reveals something about the nature of what was in that mountain, about how it operated, about whether what it did to those 5 men in the dark was deliberate or incidental. I do not have a final answer to that question, but the order of events is part of the evidence from which any honest attempt at an answer must be made. It began with the animals. The ridgeline above the Spruce Creek No. 4 was heavy timber, mostly second-growth oak and hickory with a hemlock in the lower draws, and scattered pine along the upper slopes. In those years, the wildlife populations of the southern West Virginia mountains were still largely intact, and the area above the mine entrance was ordinary productive mountain habitat. Deer moving at the tree line in the mornings, turkey calling in the hollow below the road, red-tailed hawks working the updrafts along the ridge. When I arrived in September, the forest above the mine was full of the sounds of a healthy autumn ecosystem, acorns dropping through the branches, squirrels working the canopy, crows on the road edges. In the first week of October, that changed. It did not change gradually. It changed in the way a room changes when a lamp is extinguished. Over approximately 3 days, the forest above the mine went from its ordinary inhabited sound to something close to silence. On Monday the 5th, the sounds were present but reduced. By Wednesday, they were largely absent. By Friday the 9th, The ridge above the mine was silent, in a way I had not heard a healthy mountain forest be silent, except in the hours immediately before a catastrophic storm, and there was no storm coming. The deer that had been regular at the tree line in the mornings were gone. The pair of red-tailed hawks that had nested for years in a dead sycamore above the mine road were gone from their branches and did not return. The crows that had worked the road edges every morning since I arrived were absent. A miner named Otis Bevins, who had been at the number 4 since it opened in 1905, mentioned this silence at the change of shift one afternoon, saying he could not recall the hollow going this quiet in 3 years of working there. Hollis Greer told him without emphasis that animals moved around according to their own purposes, and that Bevan's job was to attend to the coal rather than to the turkeys. Bevins accepted this without argument, and the conversation did not continue. But I had been in the mountains of southern West Virginia my entire life, and I understood the difference between animals redistributing themselves within a territory and animals having vacated a territory. And what I was observing above the Spruce Creek number 4 was the latter. The body registers certain kinds of information before the mind agrees to process them. I have come to believe this firmly after a long life that has given me several demonstrations of it. In the weeks that followed, I watched this process operate in every man on the crew at the number 4. I watched them become quieter, more attentive to ambient sounds, more inclined to pause in their work and listen. I watched them make small organizational adjustments to their positions relative to each other, closing distances, favoring the formation of pairs over the ordinary spread that efficient work requires. I watched it happening in myself, but in October, I was still in the early part of that process, still applying reasonable explanations to individual observations, still maintaining the position that each anomalous thing had a normal account that would present itself in time. The first underground incident was reported to me on the morning of October 12th. Carl Kettner and 3 other men from the night shift were standing outside the shaft entrance when I arrived for the day shift just before 6 in the morning. They had the specific appearance of men who had been very still for a very long time. Not the stillness of rest, the stillness of men who have been in a position of alert suspension and have not yet released it. They were not visibly alarmed. They were in the more complicated state that comes after alarm has passed and before a person has found a category for the thing that generated it. Carl Kettner reported to me in his characteristic way, which meant he gave me the relevant facts in the order they had occurred, and did not offer interpretation until he had completed the factual account. He said the sound had come at approximately 2 in the morning when he and 3 other men were working the lower section of the north lateral, cutting into the face of the seam. He said the sound appeared to originate from below the floor of the tunnel, from the solid rock beneath the coal seam itself, rather than from the seam or from the surrounding stone structure. He said it was not a gas sound, and he was specific about this, enumerating the characteristics of gas expression in rock as he understood them, not because he thought I was ignorant of those characteristics, but because he wanted to establish clearly why those characteristics did not apply to what he had heard. Gas hissed or produced sustained pressure. Gas made an air sound, a sound that moved through atmosphere rather than through solid material. What he had heard moved through the stone. He said the closest analogy he could offer was the sound of something large breathing at rest, each breath lasting approximately 7 to 8 seconds, the inhalation and exhalation distinguishable from each other and regular in the rhythm of a sleeping animal. He said it had lasted approximately 10 minutes and then stopped. He said the 4 men who had been in the lower section when the sound began had not returned to that section for the remainder of the shift. I asked him whether he was confident about what he had heard. It was the only time in the 20 years I knew Carl Kettner that he looked at me with anything resembling irritation. He said he had been underground since he was 14 years old, and that he knew the sounds of coal seams and the sounds of water in rock, and the sounds of structural stress and the sounds of gas expression, and that what he had heard in the lower section of the north lateral on the night of October 11th was not any of those things. Then he picked up his dinner pail and walked down the road to his boarding house, and I did not discuss the matter with him again until after November 3rd. Hollis Greer ordered a gas inspection of the lower section that morning. The inspection found nothing above normal background concentration. Greer logged the incident in the shift record as an anomalous sound of possible geological origin, and work continued on schedule. I went below on my regular day shift and worked through to the afternoon and heard nothing unusual, and returned to my boarding house and ate supper and slept and did not achieve quite the untroubled sleep I was aiming for. The tracks appeared on the morning of October 19th. I arrived at the mine at 5:40 in the pre-dawn dark, which was my usual habit, and found Hollis Greer standing at the shaft entrance with a lamp held low over the ground. He was examining the clay soil around the base of the timber framing that supported the shaft collar. The soil there was soft from a rain the previous afternoon and had held impressions clearly, the way wax holds a seal pressed into it before it sets. There were 4 prints visible on the approach side of the entrance and 3 on the left side of the framing, pressed into the clay at intervals of approximately 5 feet, suggesting a stride length considerably greater than that of a man. Each print was roughly oval in its overall form, perhaps 14 inches along its longest axis and 9 or 10 inches across at the widest point. 4 distinct elongated toes projected forward from the main pad, each tapering to a point and pressing into the clay to a depth that indicated substantial weight on each foot. Behind the main pad, a 5th impression, shorter and oriented in the opposite direction, indicated a rear-facing digit. The margins of all 7 prints were sharp and clean, pressed into clay that had softened in the afternoon rain and then hardened overnight in the cold air, preserving the shape of each print with the precision of a cast. The men who gathered around those prints over the following 30 minutes included every member of the day crew who arrived during that period, and I watched each of them look at what Greer had found and arrive at the same wordless conclusion by their own path. A boot print was identifiable as a boot print. A bear print was identifiable as a bear print. A deer print was identifiable as a deer print. Each of these things had a known form that an experienced man could name instantly. The prints in the clay at the shaft entrance of the Spruce Creek No. 4 had no name in the experience of any man standing there, and the absence of a name for something that large and that clearly formed was a different kind of unsettling than simple strangeness. Explanations were offered in the way that men offer explanations they do not entirely believe, as a way of filling the space where certainty should be. A bear walking oddly, a large bird of unknown variety, a deliberate hoax. Hollis Greer listened to each of these without endorsing or dismissing any. He ordered boards laid over the prints to preserve them and sent written notice to the company office in Williamson requesting that someone come to examine them. No one from Williamson came. The boards remained over the prints, and the men walked past them twice a day for the following 3 weeks, and the prints remained in the clay beneath the boards. And every man who walked past thought about them whether he wanted to or not. The 3rd and 4th weeks of October continued cold and clear. Work continued normally by the numbers. Coal came up the shaft in the tubs, was weighed and logged, was loaded onto wagons for the tipple. The seam was producing well. If you had read only the production records from those weeks, you would have seen nothing to concern you. But the men who went into that shaft every day were not the same men they had been in September. I watched the change accumulate across the crew over the course of those 2 weeks. The rhythm of the work had shifted in a way that had nothing to do with efficiency. Men who had been spread at the natural working distances, required by the dimensions of the sections and the practical need to swing a pick without striking a colleague, were working closer together than those requirements demanded. No instruction had been given to this effect. It had simply happened. The slow organizational self-adjustment of a group of people whose collective body has registered something that the collective mind has not yet named. I began stopping my own work every 10 or 15 minutes to stand in stillness and listen to the rock around me. Not because I had identified something I expected to hear or was looking for a specific sound, but because my body wanted a reading of the ambient sound of the mine at each moment, wanted to know what the current silence contained in the way you want to know what the air contains when you have smelled something that should not be there. When I looked up from these pauses, I would find 2 or 3 of the other men in the same posture, picks lowered, heads slightly cocked, listening. We did not discuss what we were listening for. There was nothing productive to say. On October 24th, Ruben Cook resigned his position. Ruben was from Logan County in his middle 30s and had worked at the number 4 since early in the year. He was not a nervous man. He had been in a cave-in at a Logan County operation in 1904 and had returned to underground work within 3 months, which, in the understanding of the mining community at that time, was the behavior of a man with enough constitution to continue the work. When he came to Hollis Greer on a Tuesday morning and said he was leaving, Greer asked him directly why. Ruben said he had been having dreams about the mine that were preventing adequate sleep and that he had decided he could not continue working there. Greer asked what kind of dreams. Ruben said he was always in the lower gallery working alone, which he knew was contrary to procedure since Greer required a minimum of 2 men in any section at all times. He said something came up through the floor of the tunnel. He was careful about this description. He said it did not break through the floor or displace the rock. It passed through the stone the way heat passes through stone, becoming present without destroying the material it moved through. He said it was very large. He said it stood over him in the complete darkness of the dream and looked at him, and its eyes radiated heat of the color and quality of molten iron, and the heat from those eyes touched his face in 2 specific points, and those points moved as the thing turned its gaze, and it was the sensation of those 2 points of focused burning heat on his face that woke him each time, woke him screaming. He said he had had this dream 11 times in the previous 2 weeks. Hollis Greer entered the resignation in the shift log with a single brief notation. He expressed neither sympathy nor criticism, which was consistent with how he handled most personnel matters. Ruben Cook left Lick Creek that afternoon. I saw him walking down the road toward the rail station with a single bag, and I raised a hand, and he raised one in return, and we did not speak, and I have not seen him since. After Ruben left, the crew began pairing differently in the lower sections. This was not a directed change. Hollis Greer did not instruct it. It was a self-organizing adjustment made by the crew without discussion. The kind of shift that happens when the body of a group has arrived at a decision that the minds of its individual members have not yet agreed to articulate. The men who worked the deepest sections now paired themselves with the specific man each trusted most, not simply the nearest available colleague, but the precise person each would choose if he were being honest with himself about who he wanted beside him in a difficult situation. I recognized this pattern from an operation in McDowell County in 1901 where a similar self-organization had preceded a structural collapse that killed 2 men. The crew at that operation had rearranged its most trusted pairs into its most vulnerable positions in the weeks before the collapse, as if the collective body of the group had known something was coming and had made preparations the individual minds had not sanctioned. I mentioned this to no one at the Spruce Creek number 4. There was nothing useful to say. The underground sound returned in the last days of October. I was present for this occurrence, and I want to describe it carefully because it was the first direct confirmation I had of what Carl Kettner had reported 2 weeks earlier, and because what I experienced in those 40 seconds was not what I would have predicted my response to be. I was in the main gallery, at approximately 380 feet below the surface, working a section of the seam about 40 yards from the current face. The afternoon shift had been running for about 4 hours, and the work was going well in the mechanical sense. Then the pickwork around me slowed and stopped. I've seen this happen underground when a man's lamp fails or when someone hears a structural sound, and the pattern of how it happens tells you what the cause is. This was the pattern of men who had all heard something at the same moment and had all made the same wordless decision to be still. I was already still. The sound was below me. It moved through the stone rather than through the air. I felt it in my chest and teeth before I heard it with my ears, a deep, resonant pulse, the way very low sound moves through solid material, bypassing the air and arriving directly through the structure of whatever you are standing on. Each cycle of it lasted approximately 8 seconds, the same duration Karl Kettner had described, the inhalation and exhalation distinct from each other, slow and deliberate, entirely regular. The regularity was one of the most disturbing aspects of it. A geological sound, a gas pocket expressing itself through a fracture, would produce something erratic, something that responded to the pressure dynamics of the moment. This did not. This had the regularity of a living thing breathing at rest. It lasted perhaps 40 seconds. When it stopped, the silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of a mind between sounds. It was the silence of a space that has been holding its breath. I looked up. Every man in the section had his pick lowered and his head turned slightly to one side in the posture of someone trying to angle an ear toward a specific direction. No one spoke for what felt like a full minute. Then Percy Hart said quietly that he believed it was time for his water break and walked toward the main shaft, and every man in the section followed him without a word or a backward look. We did not return to that section for the remainder of the shift. I want to describe what I felt during those 40 seconds because I believe it is relevant to any honest account of what the Spruce Creek No. 4 was and what it contained. I was not panicked. I was not frightened in the acute way, the way that the sound of failing timber or the smell of gas frightens a miner, the way that demands immediate physical response. What I felt was quieter than that and in some ways more disturbing. It was the specific sensation of being in the presence of something that was aware of you, not in the way another person is aware of you, with the mutual acknowledgement of shared consciousness. In the way that something very old and very settled in its own authority is aware of something that has entered its territory. The sensation was of being perceived and assessed by something that had not yet decided what you were or whether you mattered. I have never found a better way to describe it than that. November arrived, and the cold arrived with it, and the year began its final descent toward winter. Ice formed on the standing water in the collection pans at the mine entrance by the morning of the 1st. The ridge above the mine was white, with an early snowfall that did not melt during the daylight hours. The hollow below the road was silent in a way that had become its new normal condition rather than a temporary anomaly. The forest had not produced animal sound in 3 weeks, and it did not produce any now. The world above the mine was as quiet as the tunnels beneath it. The effect of this sustained silence on the crew was visible in the way that the cumulative effect of prolonged stress is always visible, not in dramatic expression, but in the slow compression of the ordinary behaviors that make a person recognizable. Men who had been talking at normal volume at the change of shift were talking quietly. Men who had been making the casual jokes that ease the monotony of heavy work were not making them. The crew had become a group of men who were listening all the time, above ground and below, and the effort of that constant listening was taking something from each of them that they were not getting back. On November 1st, Frank Albury and Thomas Eck refused to descend the shaft for the night shift. Both were experienced and steady miners. Frank Albury was 37 and had worked underground for 15 years without a significant incident record at any operation. Thomas Eck was 40 and had 18 years of experience in the mines of Virginia and West Virginia. They stood at the shaft entrance in the lamplight of early evening and told Hollis Greer they were not going below. Greer told them they were in breach of their employment agreement and would be docked wages, and their positions would be noted for cause. Frank Albury said he understood and remained where he was. Thomas Eck said he had a wife and 4 children and intended to continue having them. which under any other set of circumstances in any other gathering of mining men would have produced a laugh and some commentary. In that lamplight on the evening of November 1st, 1908, it produced silence. Greer dismissed both men without pay and sent notification to the Williamson office requesting 2 replacement workers for the following shift. He then turned to the remaining 5 members of the night crew and asked, in the level way he asked things, whether anyone else wished to make the same decision. No one moved. The 5 men descended in the cage at 8 in the evening, James Ray Combs first with his lamp, and the cable played out and the cage went below, and the sounds of the shaft diminished, and the surface crew went back to their positions. That was the last time any person on the surface saw those 5 men in their ordinary condition. I was at my boarding house a mile down the road when the events of that night occurred in the lower gallery, at 400 feet. I was sleeping. I've thought about this many times over the 51 years since, about being asleep in a warm room while those 5 men sat in the dark in the lower gallery with something enormous that had come down the shaft from above, and I have never arrived at a position that allows me to feel entirely comfortable with having been asleep. I was not on the night shift. I could not have known. But the body does not reason about guilt with the same instruments that the mind does. Hollis Greer woke at 5 in the morning and saw that the coal tubs had stopped arriving at the surface at midnight. He went to the shaft entrance and looked down and saw darkness and called the names of the 5 men into the shaft and received only the faint return of his own voice. He came to my boarding house at 5:30 in the morning. When I opened the door, he was standing in the dark with his lantern, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had decided he could not carry it any further. He said the night crew was not coming up. He said he needed men who were willing to go below with him. He said this without dramatics, in the way he said everything, as a statement of conditions and requirements. I told him I would come. I dressed and went with him. By the time we reached the mine, he had roused 6 other men from their nearby lodgings, men he trusted as I trusted him. We went to the shaft in the pre-dawn darkness with our lamps and our tools, 7 men plus Greer, and we descended in 2 cage loads, Greer and 3 others first, myself and 3 more following on the second run. The descent itself was mechanically normal. The cage operated as it should have. The cable ran smooth and even. The temperature changed in the expected progression, the cold surface air giving way to the more moderate temperature of the deep shaft. The smell of the mine came up as it always did. Coal dust and damp stone and the residue of lamp oil. Nothing in the physical operation of the mine had changed. The silence was different. I've worked underground long enough to know the sound of a mine between shifts, which is not silence but a specific ambient collection of small sounds. The creak and compression of timber sets under the weight of overlying rock, the movement of water through hairline fractures, the small reliable drip and trickle of seepage, the distant mechanical sounds transmitted from the surface winding engine. These sounds are constants. They are the voice of a mine that is structurally sound and operating within normal parameters, and their presence is one of the things an experienced miner listens for, because their absence means something has changed. The main gallery at 400 feet on the morning of November 3rd, 1908, was silent in the way that a sealed room is silent. Not the between-shifts quiet of an active mine. Something deeper than that. Something that had the quality of a space that had been empty for a long time. Hollis Greer led us east along the main gallery with our lamps held out, and our steps slowing as the quality of the silence became apparent to each of us in turn. The lamps made their yellow circles on the coal walls and the timber sets and the floor of the gallery, and everything those circles illuminated was in the right place. The tram tracks ran straight and clear. The tool caches at each section junction were undisturbed. The water cans were at their stations. The physical order of the mine was intact. We found the tubs first. 2 of them sat in the center of the main gallery, half loaded with coal, exactly as they would have been left if the men working them had simply put down their tools mid-cycle and walked away from the face. The picks and shovels were propped against the rib of the seam in the way you prop a tool when you intend to return to it shortly. The working lamps on the timber sets were extinguished. Everything was where it should have been except the 5 men who should have been working it. Greer raised his lamp and called the names of the night crew into the silence of the gallery. His voice went out and came back without answer. We moved further in, past the first section junction, into the north lateral toward the natural widening in the seam that the crew called the room. It was there that we found them. All 5 were alive. They were arranged against the far wall of the room, the north rib of the seam, sitting with their backs against the coal, their knees drawn up and their hands in their laps. In the posture of people who have been in one position for many hours and whose bodies have settled into that position without the relaxation of ordinary rest. They were not in the posture of unconscious men. They were in the posture of men who were awake and who had been awake for a long time in the dark. All 5 lamps were on the floor ahead of them, extinguished. The spare lamps each man carried in his kit were also extinguished. When we came around the final curve of the north lateral and brought our lamps into the room, all 5 faces turned toward us. All 5 pairs of eyes were open, and the eyes of all 5 men had been burned to a flat uniform, black from lid to lid, an opaque black that had no depth and no reflective quality, and that absorbed the lamplight we brought into the room the way charcoal absorbs light, taking it in without returning any part of it. 5 pairs of eyes, all the same color, all the same texture, all oriented toward us with an attention that was almost recognizably normal except for what it looked like. No one spoke for what felt like a full minute. Hollis Greer sat down in front of Carl Kettner and spoke to him by name in a steady, quiet voice, and after a moment, Carl Kettner turned his head toward the sound of his name and located Greer in front of him with some adjusted sense that was not the ordinary sense of sight, and said Greer's name back to him. Then Kettner began to talk. He spoke with the same controlled precision he always brought to a factual report, giving events in the order they had occurred and not offering interpretation until he had completed the account. His voice was steady in the specific way that a voice is steady when the capacity for fear has been fully used, and what remains is the capacity for description. He said the lamps had begun to fail at approximately midnight, not in the way that lamps fail from low oil or oxygen deficiency, with warning signs, with flickering and reduction before extinction. Each lamp had simply ceased to burn, as if the air had been removed from around each flame individually in sequence. He described the order, the left working lamp first, then the right, then Prater's hand lamp, then Dillard's, then Combs's, the last and final light in the section. In the complete darkness that followed, the 5 men had drawn together by sound and touch, which was the standard response to total lamp failure underground. James Ray Combs had said they would count their number and then move together toward the main shaft. The count was made and all 5 were accounted for. Then they heard the shaft cage moving. The cable drum at the surface and the cable paying out made a sound that every man in the mine knew as well as he knew his own voice. They heard it. They tracked the descent of the cage by the cable sound as it came down through the 400 feet of shaft, and they heard it stop at the bottom. They heard the cage arrive. What came off the cage was not a man. Kettner was clear about this and did not labor it. He could not see it. The darkness was absolute, and he did not claim visual knowledge. What he reported was what he heard and what he felt. He heard a sound like very large wings, not beating, held, the sound of an enormous membranous structure carried in a folded position, and with this, a soft dragging sound on the floor of the gallery, the trailing of those folded wings against the stone. This sound moved from the direction of the shaft eastward into the main gallery, and then into the north lateral toward the room where the 5 men were standing against the wall. The sound stopped somewhere in the room. He did not know the precise distance. His body's estimate, which he offered as an estimate, was approximately 15 to 20 feet from the line of men. Then he heard it breathe, slow and deliberate, each breath lasting 6 to 8 seconds. Inhalation and exhalation, distinct, rhythmic. The same sound they had been hearing through the floor of the mine for weeks. Now in the room, now close. And then the heat. Dry, radiant heat. Not the humidity of warm air, but the radiation of something at temperature, directional and concentrated. It came from two specific sources, 2 points of origin in the dark, and those 2 points of origin moved slowly across the space of the room in the way that eyes move when someone is looking at a row of objects, dwelling on each, passing to the next. When the heat reached Kettner's own face, he felt it as immediate discomfort without pain, a warmth concentrated in 2 precise points, and it dwelled on him for what he estimated was 15 seconds before moving to the man beside him. This process, the slow movement of that focused heat across each man's face in turn, was repeated. He thought it was repeated 6 times. He estimated the full duration of the creature's presence in the room at between 1 and 2 hours, with all the qualifications appropriate to an estimate made without light or watch in a condition of extreme stress. At one point, James Ray Combs made an involuntary sound. Kettner could not characterize it beyond saying it was small and involuntary, a caught breath or something similar. When Combs made this sound, the heat moved immediately toward Combs, and the intensity of it increased for approximately 30 seconds before it returned to its normal level and resumed its slow examination of each man in turn. Combs did not make another sound after that. Eventually, without warning or graduated withdrawal, the thing turned. The sound of wings and the dragging of them against the floor moved back through the north lateral toward the main gallery and toward the shaft. They heard the cage. They heard the drum turn and the cable run. They heard the cage ascend. The cable sound diminished as the cage rose through the full 400 feet of shaft, and then the sound of it was gone. The 5 men did not move for a long time after the sound of the cage was gone. Eventually, James Ray Combs said in his normal voice that they should relight the lamps. Dillard produced his striker. None of them could make their hands work well enough to operate it. They stopped trying and sat against the wall and waited. That was where we found them. We brought them to the surface in 2 cage loads. The company doctor from Williamson arrived by wagon within 2 hours of Greer's telegram and examined all 5 men in the mine office. His written examination noted that the sclera and iris of each man's eyes had undergone an apparent alteration in pigmentation that rendered them uniformly opaque and dark, but that his assessment of the underlying ocular tissue indicated that significant visual function remained or would return. His report used the phrase apparent ocular pigmentation change of unknown etiology. In the 30 years I've occasionally looked at that phrase in the copy of the report I obtained. It has never struck me as an adequate description of what I saw in that room at 400 feet. But it is what the medical record contains, and I report it accurately. James Ray Combs did not speak for 3 days. When his speech returned, it was impaired in a specific way that his wife later described to me in a letter as a difficulty starting words and keeping them going, which remained with him for the rest of his working life. His cognitive function was unaffected. He could write clearly and respond to written questions without difficulty. The impairment was specific to spoken production. He worked as a surface laborer for 2 more years, and then I lost the thread of his life. August Prouter's eyes cleared substantially over the following 2 weeks. A persistent darkening remained in the iris that was visible on close examination, but his visual function recovered to essentially normal. He married the woman from Welch in December of 1908, having made the decision to go through with the wedding regardless, which I have always thought was either very brave or very determined, depending on how you interpret it. And he moved to Western Pennsylvania in early 1909, and I received 1 letter from him the following year, and no further correspondence. Dillard returned to Logan County and his family within a week. I was told years later by a man from that county who had known the Dillard family that the darkening of his eyes never fully cleared. Wesky left Mingo County for Pittsburgh within the month. He would not speak to any of us about what had happened in the lower gallery and spoke to no one, to my knowledge, except his priest. Whatever he told his priest remained between those two men. Carl Kettner stayed in Mingo County for just over a year, working surface jobs, and then moved to Huntington. I encountered him once more in the summer of 1909. On a sidewalk in Williamson, 8 months after the events at the No. 4. His eyes had returned to something close to their normal color. He was thinner than I remembered, and he looked like a man who was sleeping better than he had been, but still not well. We sat on a bench outside the company store for a time, and I asked him the question I had been waiting to ask since November. I asked him whether he believed the thing had intended to harm them. He was quiet for a while before he answered. Then he said he did not believe harm had been the intention. He said he believed it had come down the shaft because they were in its ground, in the way that you might walk out of your house and look at a stranger who had set up a camp in your yard. Not to attack them, but to look at them and to make certain they understood whose territory they were in. He said the examination it had conducted in the dark, the slow, repeated passing of its gaze across each of them in turn, had not felt to him like the behavior of a predator. It had felt like the behavior of something that was making a determination about whether the 5 men in the room were capable of understanding where they were and what they had found. He said he believed the burned eyes were not damage in the conventional sense. He said he believed they were a mark, the way an animal marks the boundaries of its territory with its own sign so that other animals encountering those boundaries will read the mark and know whose ground they are on. He said he thought the 5 of them had been marked and returned to the surface so that the mark could be read by the people above. I have thought about this interpretation for 51 years. I have not found a better one. The Mingo Consolidated Coal Company sealed the Spruce Creek No. 4 shaft on November 6, 1908. The official explanation entered in company records was structural instability in the lower gallery, following a minor seismic disturbance. I confirmed through the State Geological Survey Office in the 1920s that no seismic event of any recorded magnitude had been logged in the region during the relevant period. The company offered no compensation to the 5 injured men and no medical account beyond the doctor's examination note. The sealed shaft was never reopened. I left Mingo County in the spring of 1909 and returned to McDowell County, where I continued working underground at various operations for another 18 years before a knee injury ended my underground career. I am not a superstitious man in the ordinary sense of that term. I do not assign supernatural explanations to things that have natural ones. But I have worked underground for most of my adult life, and I have learned that the mountain does not divide neatly into what we understand and what we do not, and that the boundary between those 2 categories is not fixed. There were reports in the years after 1908 of something moving through the hills above the Spruce Creek drainage, not from the mine, which was sealed, from the ridges above it and the hollows on either side. Livestock found in the mornings with their eyes pressed into the ground, their faces buried in the soil as if the animals had been trying to avoid seeing something directly. A surveying crew working the Tug Fork drainage in 1912 reported a shape crossing the ridgeline above their position at a speed no bird they could name would account for, moving in complete silence, a winged shape with a span they estimated at 30 feet or better. Hunters who had worked those hills for 30 years, who stopped going above certain elevations after 1908 without explaining why, and whose children and grandchildren did not go above those elevations either. I have not been back to Spruce Creek. I drove near it once in 1931 on the way to visit family in Williamson, and I came to the turn that would have taken me south toward the old mine site, and I did not take it. There is a thing that lives in those hills. It was in that ground, long before the coal companies arrived, with their machinery and their shaft cages and their production quotas and their confidence that the mountain existed for their use. It will be in that ground long after the last seam is exhausted and the last man leaves those hollows for good. We went 400 feet into its territory with our picks and our lamps, and opened passages through rock that had been undisturbed since before anyone had a name for that mountain, and it came down the shaft to make clear to us that this was not our territory, and that we were there at its tolerance. I believe it decided our tolerance had expired. I believe the 5 men it sent back to the surface, marked with burned eyes, were a message to the rest of us in the only language that would be unmistakable. And I believe the message was received because the shaft was sealed in 4 days and no one has gone back to that particular ground since. Some territories do not belong to us. Some mountains contain something that was old when the first people came to these hills, and will be old when the last person leaves them, and the age and depth of what those mountains contain is not a fact that changes, because we do not acknowledge it. We went into that ground without asking whether we were permitted to be there, and something old enough and settled enough in its own authority to not bother with anger made certain we would understand our position. It did not destroy us. It returned 5 men to the surface with burned eyes and let the rest of us read the sign. We read it. We left. The mountain kept what was in it. That is what always happens in the end. The mountain wins. It has always won. We build the shaft and sink the cage and go down with our lamps and our confidence, and the mountain waits, and eventually it makes us understand where we are, and we leave. We forget, and we come back, and the mountain waits again. It is patient in a way that nothing with a normal human span of life can afford to be. Whatever looked at those 5 men in the dark in that room 400 feet below the ridge of Spruce Creek had the patience of something that has outlasted every previous attempt to enter its territory and expects to outlast every future one. I am 82 years old, and I have been underground, by my own rough accounting, for approximately 11,000 days of my working life. I know the mountain the way a man knows something he has spent his life inside. And I know there are parts of it that know something back, that register the presence of men in their tunnels, the way the mountain itself registers the small intrusions of weather, with patience and eventually with response. The response at Spruce Creek was more direct than most, but the principle is the same. Do not go where you are not permitted to go. If you do not know where you are permitted to go, watch the animals and listen to the forest and pay attention to the sounds that come up from below the floor of the tunnel in the middle of the night. The old things in those mountains have ways of announcing themselves that are legible if you are willing to read them. The 5 men who sat against the wall of the lower gallery of the Spruce Creek No. 4 shaft with their burned black eyes on the morning of November 3rd, 1908, were the announcement made legible in the most direct possible way. I read it. I've been reading it for 51 years. I believe I've finally understood it well enough to set it down.